there's no question that long before any of us were born, there have been in this land where we are, North America, the United States, a very long and bizarre march, and Lolita wants me to stay. She's the director. Thank you, Lolita. You're welcome. From the very inception of the coming together, willfully and unwillfully, particularly in English-speaking North America, and what we now, and for 250 years, have called the United States, it's been a very, very, and particularly sort of the intersection of the land, the native people, the people of African origin, and the Europeans, plural, because there's actually a lot of interesting diversity there, north, south, urban, what have you. The nation has always been a perpetual crime scene, but also a perpetual and hurting scene, but also a perpetual place of resilience and healing that is more and often than not, or best, encapsulated in movement when and where you find it and can participate. And for me, I've always, since a child, been fascinated by the concurrent likeness and dissimilarities between places and peoples within this country that I've been blessed as even a child to be exposed to and to be immersed in. And it turns out that for me, and for those people in many places who passed through me and left with me, from Black Side to Judy to Bob's legacy and others, in fact, and some people who are in this room, like my 88-year-old freshman dean from Boston College, I'm 56, have, from different places and situations, gradually helped me to appreciate, and this is why I get to the role of place. Every living creature has a place at which they are most hopefully healthy, happy, safe, secure, awash with justice. And I really don't know how outside of place. Life happens in place. Bad policing, good policing, bad education, good education, environmental, it happens in places. And we know that you can map the same places that have these disparities on this policy issue or social index has the same degree, but different kind of concurrent, right? Unhealth, injustice, and so forth. So, I think a very important thing, and Bob was an excellent example of this, is to immerse oneself in a place, its elders, its traditions, its children, its environment, including but not limited to its political circumstances, its economic circumstances. Because even though those frequently, typically, afflict places like Turkey Creek, Roxbury, these Boston public schools which slaughters more children than it saves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The fact is that it's in those places. Places contain communities, and no matter how maligned or attacked those communities are, like Bromley Heath, thank you, Miss Anne Ray. Those places are not only their own best hope, with their own legacies and exemplars and elders and stories to inform and to heal when needed, to inform when needed, right, to get your back when needed. It's community. And that exists in places. And that defines my work. in Turkey Creek and here on Wakulla Street in Boston. And it takes all kinds of people from within and without these communities. And that's the connection, because there's only one story, and they're all connected. And when you lift one, it needs to be for the benefit of its kindred, sister communities and places and peoples, or otherwise the entire table will never turn to what we all, in varying ways and degrees, want. So that is what I would say. And it's very helpful for your coping to feel connected and bigger, but that this too shall pass, or somebody else has done this or been this before. Maybe this is a different iteration, but it's not of anything that's not old. Keeps me going. And my health is a lot better, but it could be much better. Thank you.
Well, I think a lot of the questions are about the place, and as Derrick was talking, I'm thinking a lot about the other places where I've told related stories, and I'm thinking about Gus Newport, who was mentioned earlier. He's been a real mentor to me. We both ended up in California, where we were both from. And we've stayed connected, and we've actually been trying to find ways to tell more stories that are stories of self-determination and the kinds of stories that Derrick and I have been involved with. So I'm thinking about Gus, and I'm also thinking about a lot of people in this room who actually helped make this happen and are connected. And I want to make sure to mention, I think Bill Anderson is back there, who helped to edit this film. Rita and her son London were involved, and they were my kids are here, my dad is here. And actually I was going to say, when I was talking about how we made this happen and the lack of support before Katrina sort of brought attention. My kids were born in 2006, right after Katrina, so there actually were people that we were able to hire to go out on the road and follow Derrick on his Katrina Renewable Express. So there were, any film is collaborations, and just so many people who were part of this. And I'm thankful for that community, and I'm thankful for the community that Derrick and I came from Blackside, and all that we learned there. I don't know, I feel like it's more about the story.
There's a sense in which I feel overwhelmed.
Oh, I'm sorry, can you hear me now? I feel overwhelmed. Derrick, you've taken me back to Mississippi I was there in 1964. And understanding Mississippi then, and then looking at your story, you really represent or present a microcosm of what it means to organize. And I really would like to look at the movie again, because I think it's an analysis on how you organize. And it's a window on how, not just Bob, but all of the people, young people, the Mississippians, what it took to change, to move the dial just a little bit. And so much is in that movie, including your brilliance. And so I just really, really appreciative of it. There's one thing that I've not become. I've always been interested in history, and I think of myself as a learner, a shade tree. I'm not a historian, but clearly a learner. And one of the things that struck me about the movie was the date, 1866. 1866. So that was the year after the Civil War that the first Civil Rights Act was passed by the Reconstruction Congress, which sought to make a democratic, multiracial nation out of America's slaveocracy. It lasted 7 years, right? But within those 7 years, your great-great-grandfather established a community to establish sovereignty, to live wholly. Right? What happened to Turkey Creek cannot be separated from this history of Reconstruction and refusal of this country to allow Black people to live wholly, right? To really dismantle America's apartheid. So what Turkey Creek represents to me is more than Turkey Creek and just the story, because it's a frontline community all throughout this nation. There are frontline communities like Turkey Creek that are fighting climate change and fighting being toxic dump sites, right? And they are there, they are the communities on the front line because of the failure of this country to reconstruct itself. And we have to understand that in order for this country to change, Turkey Creek is an example. The resilience is what gives us hope. But we have to go back to 1866 and understand what people were trying to build at that particular time, that this country has refused to acknowledge. The blueprint for what we need to do was laid out in 1866, 1875. And so I would ask all of us to revisit that history and also to understand that it was undone by violence. Violence, the murder, the wanton murder of Black people in this country after Reconstruction. And the fact that after 100 years, right, that what we were given in 1964 was public accommodations, which had been achieved through the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Right, so we were going back to the future. So I'm going to stop here, but I would like for us to understand the broader context. And I think you asked, when does it end? It never ends. It never ends. The struggle is endless, right? We have to begin, I think, to ask the right questions and to understand what the struggle is about. Bob Alford talked about sugar and sand. He said, when you're on the beach, can you pick out the sugar from the sand? Right? Well, if you think the sand is sugar and that's what you're going to put in your lemonade, you're in trouble. So we have to learn, we have to begin to discern, and we have to know the history. We have to know the history.
So I have a question about playing offense, because I came out so strongly in the movie, and actually my dad used to complain about that a lot near the end. He said, we don't know how to play offense. And I hadn't heard anybody say that until you talked about that in the movie. So I'm wondering if you and Leah would speak about that.
Also add something about everything that's been happening in recent years.
I am so happy to hear this, Maisha, that Bob left us with this reminder. There is no struggle, there is no contest, there is no sporting event or game that is won by blocking points solely. You can't win the NBA Finals just blocking shots. You have to put the ball in the basket. You have to have an offense. The purpose of defense is to get off of it and onto offense so that you can start to win. And when you really appreciate the history back to 1866, and hopefully in fundamental ways even further, like first contact between Native European and African American on the Eastern Seaboard, which is not only where we are in Massachusetts, but like where the Lumbee people are in North Carolina or along the coasts, you know, the intersection, slavery was a horrible human holocaust. And it was also a land use, planning, and zoning decision, frankly, first, right? Conquering subject, this explains why historically American policy towards most Native American peoples has been one of extermination versus assimilation as second-class citizens or slaves were had. And we live in increasingly, frankly, dangerous times if you look at the paradigm of the fundamental ways, which is the brilliance of the Algebra Project and the idea of correcting a gap that is going to become more and more consequential and adverse to our people as the way in which powers that be are practiced and structured evolve over time. And you need a better and newer and more comprehensive offense, right? Even more so than previous generations or decades. And I think that's one of the reasons why I have gradually learned to prioritize place, because it's at a granular local level that you can really marinate and learn from outside the history, the inside the history, the people, the traditions, the stories, the personalities of place, even of the environment. And in doing so right there, you are an exemplar to yourself as well as other communities that don't have to be exactly situated the same, but similarly or kindredly, so that your story capital, your relational capital, the reverberating capital becomes discernible and part of a mobilizable offense, I think. And two places where this is very much the case is still Turkey Creek, where the fight is not over. It is not over. In fact, it reminds me in some ways of that old cartoon, The Road Runner, where Wile E. Coyote always comes back again with another, usually very stupid way to catch the road runner. And I could go on, but I'll tell you, in Turkey Creek, the son of the late Butch Ward and the son of one of his biggest supporters on the city council in Gulfport, Mississippi, who's now the mayor, and who I went to high school with in the early 80s, are still fighting every kind of way they can, like Wile E. Coyote, to get some kind of federally funded at-grade road into those historic wetlands that have never been developed by anybody, white or black, because they're not fit for it. But they've tried every couple of 3 years, I come up with a different Wile E. Coyote plan. And thank God and thank goodness, because of the relational capital, the story capital, our family capital, members like Leah and the connections, yes, to City like Vita Urbana, to DSNI, to SNCC. There is a river, as Vincent said, and we are in that river, and that river will not dry up. that river needs to produce the offensives. And frankly, I'll end with this, here in the shadows of Harvard University, that sometimes specialization is our worst enemy. Over-specialization can be a big impediment to community self-knowledge growth, and the cultivation of an offense. In Boston, where I unexpectedly and reluctantly a year ago got involved with a fight that shouldn't have been a fight in the city of Olmsted for public old growth trees in Malcolm X Park in the 200th year of his birth, adjacent to the childhood home of Malcolm X, as well as the worst heat island and asthma rates for black and brown children in Boston. There should not have been 135 trees marked for removal 2 years after a community process that I and others participated in, and they did not call for that. And it certainly shouldn't be happening while, in fact, I had to tell the mayor of Boston that I missed the days when Boston was just racist. Because nobody there before, and nobody in Mississippi in any elected office, any of the folks in Gulfport, make pledges to environmental justice to get elected. Make pledges to climate resiliency to get elected. Make pledges to public health and children to get elected. But you have to do that here. You have to be a cheerleader in the echo chamber of the platitudes, or you will not be taken seriously by folks who believe in pieces of those things. And it is, I thought I'd never say this, but sometimes lately it has been refreshing to find myself waking up in the morning in Turkey Creek and not Roxbury. But again, that's a community. Well, God bless them, because it happened adjacent, not to where Derrick Evans was, but to the Wakulla Street community and the Friends of Melnia Gas Boulevard. And Alana Feaster, who may or may not be here, across the street from Mellow Bush Mine. So I didn't know any of these people. I remembered DSNI, I remembered City Life. And here we are now. And because the community has spatial and relational capital, and we are right now like almost like Oppenheimer in the Manhattan Project, but for a good reason, cultivating our story capital. God save the Boston Municipal Administration or Department that tries again to mess with Wakulla Street, and thereby its sister situations.
I just want to mention a few things that we probably don't have time to get into, but so much has happened in Turkey Creek, and just 2 weeks ago or something, Derrick was narrating a tour of the Gulf Coast, ending up in Turkey Creek, going through Turkey Creek for a whole busload of Sierra Club people of color, and talking about Rose Johnson's legacy. Rose is sadly one of the people who's gone, but there's a whole new generation of people doing that work. And a couple of things I'll mention are just during the Trump administration, Derrick managed to get $500,000 from the National Park Service for a museum in Turkey Creek. I could go on. One other thing I'll mention is that after Katrina, the Ford Foundation and some other big funders decided it was wise if local people were involved in making decisions about where funding should go. And so people within the Environmental Grant Makers Association created something called the Gulf Coast Fund for Ecological Renewal, Community Renewal and Ecological Health. So Derrick was one of 24 advisors people like Derrick across the Gulf Coast who were giving grant money. And we partnered with them to create a community journalism project that was very active for many years. We were just about to launch it to try to bring attention back to the Gulf Coast after Katrina, years after Katrina, and then the BP disaster happened, and the stories were about that, about the fishing communities, the Vietnamese communities, the Black oyster communities, and so just, there's a lot that's Turkey Creek has spawned.
I'd just like to, I'm piggybacking on Derrick, when you talked about strategy and how absolutely essential it is that you have a strategy to deal with the problems that you face. And what is necessary in having that strategy is that you have to have a level of intelligence, intel, about the situation. So I'll just give an example. I was reading The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and there's another book that I bought that everybody should look at. It's Dumping in Dixie. And they don't particularly mention, I think he does mention Turkey Creek. I haven't finished reading it, but the intersection between what we think of as environmental justice and climate change, it's all connected, right? And we have to begin to understand that connection. There's a stealth operation. You have your wily, your crossroads character. And so Richard Rothstein, in his Color of Law, and in Dumping in Dixie by Bullard, who was the father of environmental justice, he talks about, the question is, why is it that if you are Black and middle class, your chances of having asthma and all of the medical problems that are found in poor communities, why are you not saved? Right? Why isn't your moving into a middle class community a safety place for you? Well, the reason, and this is, I was really blown away when I found out about this. The toxic waste conglomerates, the major ones, they study demographics. And they look at communities that are moving from being white communities to being Black communities. And historically, the tolerance has been, because there are no integrated communities in America by and large, they're either turning white or turning Black. So they are interested in communities that will, in 20 years from now, will probably be Black. And they get contracts with these governments, with these local municipalities. This is where they're going to put their waste site 20 years from now, right? Because they know who's going to live there. Black people are going to live there. So to understand the level of, it's hard, finality, right? That the oppression is specific. Right, and to begin to understand what is responsible for these outcomes is very important. So if you think, well, what should we do? We need to know about the demographics. We need to know what the major toxic waste conglomerates in the country, where they're putting Superfund sites, where they have agreements to put them 20 years from now, 25 years from now. They are investing. So I just wanted to add that, and just one other thing, the story of Clyde Kennard from the Gulfport. I think he was from Gulfport. Clyde Kennard, he applied to the Southern Mississippi University. I think that's what it's called now. And he happened to be African American, and he was, after applying, he was accused of stealing chicken wire. Chicken wire. And he ended up in Parchman Penitentiary. And I tell this story, it's not about environmental justice, but it's about the ecology, right? Of places like Turkey Creek and all around this country that the convergence of the oppression. So when we were in Mississippi, Bob often said, he said, you know, we didn't really know about Clyde Kennard. It was sort of, his story wasn't out there. They kept him in parchment until he developed cancer and then released him, and he is now no longer with us. But he was a mover, a shaker, a young person, and had the audacity to try to get an education from University of Mississippi. It's not the University of Mississippi, but it's Mississippi State. I think they changed their name. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. So the stories, and telling these stories that allow us to get a deeper understanding of what we're dealing with in this country. And unless we understand that we are dealing with an apartheid state, right, then what we do becomes window dressing, heartfelt, but window dressing.
I want to add that, I'm thinking now of Harriet Tubman. You see, it's very important to have a big picture, a truthful big picture analysis or worldview. It has become a worldview. And then in the more sort of micro sense, you have to, with honesty and courage as a community individual, also ask what is in your hands, or could be. There's an old saying that when the lion, or the lions tell the story of the hunt, the story will sound very differently. And I've been thinking about that a lot over the years. And it occurred to me that if the tables were turned and the lion was going to end up telling the story of the hunt, lions being lions and hunts being hunts, and storytelling being storytelling, all of which are in the mix, right? It seems to me that the most important story that the lion says or tells is the story that the lion or lioness tells to themselves and to their den, and develops and transitions from an analysis to a worldview. Because without an internalized narrative of surviving, enduring, living to tell the story however they want to tell it and to whomever they want to tell it, is an inward conversation between the lion and the lion's self, which lions being lions means the lion and the community that the lion lives in, right? The pride, right, of lions. I think that's a very important thing for us to bear in mind, because my mother's father, my grandfather, was the son of the well driller, was always very adamant, when I was a child, of making me be mutually aware of the cards stacked against me and the cards that I inherited with which to play. And he goes, and if you do certain things and you associate in certain spaces and places, which ended up being black side, and so forth and so on, you're going to acquire more cards, which I now call story capital, relational capital, spatial capital, even financial capital, as and when it's available and needed. Because of why? The story of the cards. Like, think about it, the lion has to study the forest, or doesn't have a prayer of surviving the hunt or prevailing as a hunter or gatherer or whatever. You follow what I'm saying here? It's a very interesting layered human conversation that happens within us, ideally, and within our families and communities. And I think it's absolutely necessary to cultivate the offense, the inspiration, the recognition of authentic heroes among us who are not well-known or famous and so forth and so on. and to nurture and heal us when other things aren't there to do so. That's what I think about that.
I just want to say something about the Bob Moses Fund, because I really appreciate, as I've learned about it, that Derrick does not apply for things. He gets other people to apply for things. He partners with organizations and with people who, he said to me recently, I can make it rain, but I don't have any buckets. Like, he makes things happen, but he really relies on community to carry out plans. And so I really appreciate that the Bob Moses Fund seeks out people that, like Derrick, that have a mission and aren't looking for help, but need it, or need support, need resources.
They're catalysts. Gil Scott Heron said the revolution will never be televised. I have a book here. Has anybody heard of Hollis Watkins?
Yes.
How many people? Brilliant, you get an A in the course if you've heard about Hollis. What about Matt Cotton? Brenda Travis? Super cool daddy. Steptoe. John Steptoe. Steptoe, you got it. Okay. So I listed names, given names, and Victoria Gray. Okay. But these are not names that are well known. Anzie Moore. Okay. So we don't have 10 people. There would be no Bob Moses in Mississippi if it weren't for Anzie Moore. And we don't know about him. Amzie had the plan for the voter registration campaign in Mississippi. He and Bob met in 1960. Ella Baker sent Bob to Mississippi to find out what's going on in Mississippi. Now, why would she send him to Mississippi? Only because for years before, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, people were organizing in Mississippi. Voter campaigns were being held. And in the mid-50s, there were people who were run out. Dr. Howard was run out. Amzie Moore was able to stay, right? Steptoe, these were all black trees that had decided that they were not going to leave and they were going to fight in Mississippi, and they did. So Amzie Moore had the plan. Mr. Peacock, he had 2 sons, and Bob tells the story. One day, Bob was staying with Amzie, and Bob said, Amzie said, come on, Bob, let's go. And he said, Amzie would never tell you where you were going, or when you were going. He would just say, let's go. And so they went to Mr. Peacock's home in Tallahatchie County, and Amzie wanted Mr. Peacock to meet Bob as a reputable young man. He thought that Bob would impress him. And he asked Mr. Peacock for one thing. He asked Mr. Peacock for his sons. He said, will you give me your sons to work with Bob to do this voter registration work? So Mr. Peacock was part of the underground, right? Steptoe was part of the underground. Ella Baker knew who these people were and where they were situated. Right? And so if we talk about the spirit of Bob Moses and the movement, we have to understand that the revolution is not televised. The real revolution is not televised. Neither would it be possible without the work of people who work close to the ground, right? Quietly close to the ground. So this is Hollis. I think I'm holding him up. Emily, I think you know Hollis. This is Hollis when he was 19 years old. He and Matt Cotton were involved with the movement in Macomb, the student movement. And and Bob had to hide them out on Vernon Damer's farm in Hattiesburg. And they had to work. Vernon Damer gave them money, right, so that they could support their work in registering people to vote. So this is pure grassroots. We in SNCC got $9.60 a week when the weather be good. But they had none. So anyway, maybe, would you want to read it? Yeah. So, so this is the spirit in which Bob lived, as told by Hollis. Hollis is looking back on his life when he was 18 years old and just a high school student. And it's this spirit that, I shouldn't say invigorate, I'm looking for the right word, but informs, imbues, and it's the spirit of the movement that we are trying to honor with the Bob Moses Fund. And so we're looking for diamonds in the rough. Derrick? And we want to give them the kind of support that they need to do what they know how to do best. And we understand that is only by investing in, and there are many ways to invest in people who are working on the ground that you don't know about, that major philanthropy would probably never give money to. Right? Nobody would give money to Ames and Moore. Nobody would give money to Mr. Peacock. Okay? So that's what the Bob Moses Fund is about. Yeah.
So this is Hollis. As Bob began to tell us about SNCC, he would tell us about the various ways in which they interacted with the people to make them more comfortable. And singing was a primary way of making the people feel comfortable. Of course, coming from the church, I understood and liked that tactic immediately because I love to sing, and because it revealed to me that Bob and SNCC were about the people they were here to help. They were not here to change the people, but to help the people become more of themselves, to help the people reach their potential. That meant a lot to me. Usually, when someone was so-called trying to help Black folk, that help seemed always to include making Black folk more sophisticated by teaching them how not to act so country, or so Black, or so emotional. Okay, so we're nearing the close of our program, and so maybe you have one more comment? Okay.
This both will answer part of what happened next in Turkey Creek, as well as linkages with Boston. And most importantly, what the resources from the Bob Moses Fund have actually accomplished, just a part of what it is. A couple of years ago, as you see here, I nearly lost all of my property in Boston, which is what paid for, I already knew that the Ford Foundation and this foundation and myself were never really necessarily going to set horses, right? But I was taught well by both my grandfather and my incredible best teacher in real life, Amanda Houston, the daughter of a Pullman porter, an African-American communist registered nurse, born in Malcolm X's same birthday, a year after Malcolm, here in Boston, and who ran the Black Studies program at Boston College, and who frankly is the person who reined me in. Because prior to that, I was content with just the fantastic world around me and exploring it and learning things for the sake of learning them, but not doing anything with that. And Amanda Houston was not going to let anybody remain on that path or non-path. She is one of these unhistoricized, brilliant organizers and women, African-American, Bostonian, who could literally see behind multiple corners. You talk about strategy. She was something else. But anyway, by grace of God, I didn't lose the property on Wakulla Street. And in fact, used it, as some of you have seen recently, to house people who, part of the strategy, would become my neighbors as homeowners on Wakulla Street, so that we can increase the footprint. Because if there's one thing in this country that's respected when other things collapse, it's the rights of property and property ownership. Now, it's something that's very strong in Mississippi, which actually leads the nation in African American home ownership. Mississippi, poorest state with the lowest income per capita. That's again a reminder to me of the importance of place and what's in your hand versus what's not, and how you leverage it. But anyway, I didn't lose my property. I and we in Boston, and very stealthily, because I wasn't trying to be visibly or even very busy in Boston, but we doubled down, and I think we're now up to like 10 or 11 houses on Wakulla, Dale Street, including a house that City Life Vida Urbana helped me help a neighbor get $83,000 cash 30 months after they had been foreclosed upon by a predatory thing.
Right.
They had all of their efforts.
Right.
But then we pivoted, because I got this saying on Wakulla Street, I'm not going to try to live to be a 80 or 85-year-old exhibit in an old historic, used to be Negro community museum, right? And so their house, it turns out, which was built in 1852, same year as the Fugitive Slave Law, and has a tunnel between the carriage house and an outbuilding nearby, is 97% sure to have been a stop on the Underground Railroad. And that was here in Boston. Now, as far as the fund's impact, it turns out, some 2 years ago, maybe, I don't remember. But I did what I often do, which is find resources that don't exist. And I miraculously, and community members set this up, they asked me, and they said, hey, the Harrison County School Board, which owns the property where the historic colored school is in Turkey Creek, and then there was the Head Start for years, is now vacant because the local agency that ran the Head Start went out of business. It's derelict, it's vandalized, it's a liability, and it's not on Section 16 land, which is most of the schools in west of the Appalachians in different states, or the money the resources that the state produces to fund education, is on every 16th out of 32 sections of a range of a township in a map. Okay? And if you come from a land-owning black community in the South or the Midwest, you understand these ranges and these townships in Section 16. Well, this wasn't on Section 16 land because the community had, since the 1880s, operated its own community school, and in the 1930s, Harrison County, Mississippi School Board realized that they did not even provide any separate and unequal education for blacks for Turkey Creek. So they bought it from the community, and it was on historical ancestral land. So my mother went to school there. Before that, her father, the well driller, they all went to school there. That was land that Grandma Melinda Benton, who was born a slave in Kentucky, donated for a church, a parsonage, and a school in Turkey Creek. And her daughters, who had learned to read and write across from Vicksburg during and after the Civil War at the Freedmen's Camp, came to Turkey Creek, thank God, 15, 20 years later, the first 3 families, and became the teachers, and became the wives and the mothers and the matriarchs. Well, the school board wanted to lease this property, 2 acres, 2 buildings, to to the community for $1 a year, and I said no. Because they want you to cover the liability, the insurance. You'll never be able to get a mortgage or a loan or a grant or anything else if you don't own it. Tell them we'll buy it. Well, we did. The racist principal of Harrison Central High School when I was in the 10th grade was now the superintendent of the county schools. He signed my deed that cost $40,000 to purchase the school. And we have plans for that school. And Leah mentioned the $10,000 spent on this dilapidated, falling down building that nobody remembered the history of until we found out. It was the paymaster's office of the old turpentine plant that blew up and killed all these workers. National Park Service hears about it. They throw in $500,000. We restore it. Rip was the contractor, my cousin Rip. And for the first time ever, the Southern Society of Architectural Historians gave their Best of the South Award for historic preservation to that building.
Thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you.